Hello, so welcome to the second video for this week, and I'm going to be talking about Parmenides. He's still a pre-Socratic, but I've split him off from the rest because we've got substantial fragments of his writing available. We're going to have a look at one of his arguments in a bit more detail, I suppose. Okay, so what can we say about Parmenides? There he is. I'm sure it doesn't surprise you to see that he looks like that. And he flourished in 450 BC. Things were happening in the Greek world at this time, and I'll say a little bit about those in a minute. He founded the Eleatic school, so he's the first of the Eleatics, and that also includes Zeno and some other people. And the Eleatics were famous for arguing that change doesn't really occur and that time doesn't really exist, and in fact that the universe is, in some sense or other, a single unity or one thing. We'll come to those sorts of ideas shortly. Well, it's called the Eleatic school, by the way, because Zeno and Parmenides were alive in or lived in a place called Elea. I might go to my map in a minute. In fact, I think I will, and show you a little bit about that. His major work, unsurprisingly, is called On Nature. I said that all the pre-Socratics tended to write something called On Nature, and so did he. Written in the form of a poem, although as we'll see, it doesn't rhyme. So it's like a prose poem, and it doesn't seem very poetic to me. Maybe again the Greek sounds nicer than the English. Split into two sections, this poem on nature. The first section, the way of reality, or on the nature of reality, something like that, describes how the world really is in and of itself. The second half of the poem, on the way of opinion, describes how the world seems to be. So you get these. You'll see he argues in the first section that time doesn't exist and change doesn't occur, and his idea there is that reality in itself doesn't contain time. Reality in itself doesn't change. Although he's perfectly aware that this is a really odd conclusion, and in the second half of the poem, he talks as if time does occur, and if time is real, and changes do occur. The idea is meant to be the appearance-reality distinction. How things appear to us to be are not how they really are. And in this he foreshadows a lot of later writers, as I've mentioned already in the Week Zeros videos. J.M.E. McTaggart in 1908 also had that kind of a view. But it also foreshadows other people, and Immanuel Kant as well, who I will say a bit more about than I say in the book, as I've said I would. He also thought something like this, that reality in itself doesn't contain time. It's rather our minds which project time into the universe. So, yeah, that's Parmenides' view too. And we've got substantial fragments available, and we'll turn to some of those shortly. But first then, let's go back to our little map, and none of this which I'm saying about the kind of what's going on in Greece is that important. We're more interested in the philosophical ideas, but I do like to get some context for this. Alright, so what's going on? 450 BC, as I said. Some important stuff going on. Athens is now rising to importance from its previous state of just being like any other of the Greek city-states. It was always quite a big one, but now it was gaining importance in the region in terms of trade. They got a good navy, a really good navy, built by a chap called Themistocles. Anyway, Pericles is also on the scene at this point, and he's building the Acropolis and the Parthenon and so on. That's all being built in Athens. Socrates has been born, so Socrates is wandering the streets of Athens at this time as well, pontificating, arguing with people, and so on. Parmenides gets called a pre-Socratic, remember, because he wasn't really particularly influenced by, I think I said earlier, the writing of Socrates. I mentioned anyway. Socrates didn't write anything down either, but by the thoughts. He wasn't influenced by Socrates, as many other philosophers, well, every other philosopher since, I suppose, has been. So yeah, at the time, Athens were at war. They were fighting. The Greeks liked a good old war. They were fighting with Sparta in the so-called First Peloponnesian War. These down here are the Peloponnese, and yeah, Athens and Sparta were fighting with each other. But anyway, it was a good time there in Athens. But Parmenides wasn't from Athens. he was from Elea. So worth saying a little bit here. So at this time as well, the Greek colonies were becoming quite well established. So as I said earlier, the Greeks were like frogs around a frog pond, with the Aegean Sea being the frog pond. They were sort of stationed around like this, and also on the islands in between. But now I mean, for a long time they'd been sending out people and establishing colonies elsewhere, and this was getting, but this was really, they were really taking root and becoming major cities in their own right. So, just to give you some idea, they established colonies all along here, along the north of the Turkish coast. Trabzon, for example, is an important was an important Greek colony. Important Greek city was there. Sevastopol, there was a Greek city there in modern-day Ukraine. Well, I say modern-day Ukraine. The Crimea, that area's been annexed, hasn't it, by Russia? So I suppose it's Russia now. I don't know what the officials. Anyway, Sevastopol was an important Greek colony. So was Varna in Bulgaria, and so on. A lot of Greek colonies over here. But more important for our purposes then, also in Italy, along the coast down here, along the coast up here, and across along Sicily, Syracuse. There was a big Greek colony there. You can there's some nice ruins you can go and have a look at. Taormina was another Greek colony, and yeah, that's where the library was, where they think that some of Anaximander's books were, and right, so you got all these places were being colonized. Oh, well, let's just go back over here briefly. So somewhere here, near Izmir, yeah, Foça, there it is. So Foça, it was called Phocaea at the time, was one of the original Greek city-states, and they sent out a colony, and they colonized over here, just below Naples. I think it's in somewhere on this dip. See if we can find it. Velino, is that it? Ah, no, there it is, Velia. So there we go. Some more Greek ruins there. Velia is, well, what it's now called. That's the Roman term, but this is Elea. Okay, so it was a Greek colony of Foça, or Phocaea, and this is where Parmenides lived and where Zeno lived as well. Okay, so they're over there in modern-day Italy. All right. Anyway, just a little brief explanation of what's going on in the Greek world. There's lots more going on, but anyway, that'll do us. So back to our piece. So we've got substantial fragments available. Let's have a look at one of them. So this is from the first part of the poem, The Way of Reality, or On Reality, and this is where he's trying to argue then that time doesn't exist and that changes don't occur. Let's have a look at it. I'll try and read this out, although I tend to stumble over this, because anyway. It never was, nor will be, since it is now, altogether one continuous. For what birth will you seek for it? How and whence did it grow? I shall not allow you to say nor think from not being, for it is to be said nor thought that it is not. And what need would have driven it later rather than earlier, beginning from nothing to grow? Thus it must be either completely or not at all. And how could what is be in the future? How could it come to be? For if it came into being, it is not, nor is it if it is ever going to be in the future. Thus coming to be is extinguished and perishing unheard of. Yeah, okay, another rather difficult and not very poetic, is it? I assume in the Greek it sounds nicer, although I haven't really checked. Yes, so we got a lot of interpretive work to do here, as usual with the pre-Socratics, but it's very clear that there's something going on. This idea about how can anything come into being, because if it did, it'd have to come from something, and what's it supposed to come from? So that is, suppose that the universe didn't exist. Well, how could it come into being? What would it come from if it didn't exist before? And indeed, if it is going to cease to exist, then how could it, what does it go into? These sorts of ideas. And Anyway, I'm not going to dwell on this itself because we're going to have a look at some interpretations of it now. So many writers over the years have tried to give an interpretation of what's going on. One popular interpretation, reasonably popular interpretation, is that it's got something to do with the idea of what's gets called the principle of sufficient reason. I'm not going to talk about that one. We'll talk about the principle of sufficient reason next week when we talk about Leibniz's view. Or maybe we'll talk about it when we talk a bit later about. Actually, we'll talk about it a bit later this week when we talk about what's he called? I've forgotten his name. Anyway, we'll come to him. So what we're going to do, though, first of all, is look at what's probably the most popular interpretation of what's going on here. So there's a sense in which we're not really that bothered about exactly what he meant. What we're interested in is what can we take from this? What argument does it suggest? What can we construct from this? Because what he actually said, to a certain degree, isn't important. What's important is the argument itself that we can produce. So we can always judge and think about arguments in their own terms. So okay, this is, as I said, probably the most common or the most popular interpretation. It's found amongst a lot of people. Bertrand Russell gives something like this interpretation. There's a guy called Turetsky who does the same, and Copleston. So there's a bunch of Copleston's a famous historian, a philosopher, philosophical historian. So all right, let's have a look at it. So P there represents a premise. Let's go back to. There's definitely something here. This bit where he says, "I shall not allow you to say nor think from not being, for it is to be said nor thought that it is not." So he's got this idea, and I should mention this is fairly clear, that if you are to think anything at all, what you think cannot be contradictory. So he has this idea that if you think of something that's contradictory, then actually you don't think anything at all, right? That's the idea. So you might, as it were, think you're having a thought, but if what you are thinking is contradictory, in fact you're not having a thought in any sense. It's just an empty thought. Okay, so all right. So we get premise 1. To think of nothing is to think of nothing as being something, i.e. to think of what is not that it is. So that's sort of drawn from the poem there. So the idea there, to think of nothing, you must be thinking of nothing as being a thing, and therefore it's to think of that thing, therefore nothing as being a thing, being something. Next premise. To think of nothing as being something is contradictory, right? And so is to try to think something that is not in fact thinkable. So remember this idea, if you do think something that's contradictory, in fact you're not thinking anything at all. So to think of nothing as being something is actually to have a contradictory thought, and so is to think of, in fact, nothing. And therefore it's not possible to think of nothing, so that follows from 1 and 2 there, right? So to think of nothing is to think of it being something. That's contradictory, and so it's not really to think anything at all. So you can't actually think about nothing. So then the next step, another premise, to think that things come into or go out of existence is to think that they arise from nothing or they pass away into nothing. So here the thought is, all right, suppose you think that things change. Well, if you think that things change, then you've got to be thinking that things come into existence and go out of existence. But if you think that they come into existence, then you must think that they come from nothing. And if you think that they go out of existence, they must go into nothing. But we've just said that it's not possible to think of nothing, right? But here we've got the idea, to think that things come into go out of existence requires that you think of nothing. But because you can't, to think that things come into and go out of existence is in fact to think something that's unthinkable. And so it's not possible to think that things come into and go out of existence. I hope that that's relatively clear. I hope that you can follow that sort of line of thought there. This is a valid argument. these, so at the points where we've got from 1 and 2, from 4, from 6, I think these do indeed follow from the premises. Yeah, so whatever is thinkable. And so, yeah, let me say a bit about that premise. But it would therefore get nothing ever comes into go out of existence. So this is a further thing, which is to say, if something is the case, then you must be able to think about it. So, given that you can't think about things coming into going out of existence, it therefore follows that nothing in fact does ever come into or go out of existence. So that is, think about this is, if something is, then it is thinkable, right? Well, the contrapositive of that is to say, if something is not thinkable, then it is not, right? Maybe I'll illustrate. We're going to reject this argument, by the way, as a whole, but nonetheless, this is a kind of a... let's go to here. We've got the online whiteboard again. Okay, let's go to this. All right. So, okay, we're thinking about whatever is thinkable. Okay, this can be understood as being a conditional. If something is, or let's put it in terms of exists, if something exists, in fact, let's put this even more clearly. Oops. If something X exists, then X is thinkable, or if you like, it is possible to think about X. Okay, so if something X exists, then X is thinkable. That's if something exists, then Q, it's thinkable. Well, propositions of the form if P then Q are equivalent to if not Q, then not P. That's called the contrapositive. So whenever you've got something, if P then Q, so if grass is green, then snow is white, it's going to follow that, well, if it's not the case that snow is white, then it's not the case that grass is green. That's a logically equivalent. So we get from this, well, you can see if X is not thinkable, then X does not exist. Okay, so that's the force of that premise. I hope that's relatively clear. Let's go back to it. And okay, there's something in that. It's a reasonable, perhaps, reconstruction of what's going on. But notice here that he doesn't. There's no mention of time in there. This is directed at the idea that change doesn't occur. That misses something because he does talk about time in the original passage. And maybe it follows from this you can have as a corollary, well, if nothing ever comes into and goes out of existence, well, then time doesn't exist. But yeah, this is directed at the idea of change, predominantly, that change doesn't happen. Nothing ever comes into or goes out of existence. But the major reason why this argument is not particularly, we're not very interested in this reconstruction, is simply because, well, it relies upon this first premise, right? You need premise 1 to be true when you combine it with 2 to get 3, because then 3 plays in to give us 6, and then 6 is needed to give us 7, and then 7 is needed to give us 9. So 1 is absolutely crucial, and premise 1, it looks like, is a false premise. So according to premise 1, it says to think of nothing is to think of nothing as being something, and I just think that's false. It's not, to think of nothing is not to think of, I mean, maybe if you think of nothing you are thinking about nothing as being something, but it's not really what's going on when we think of nothing. So let's just get rid of all of this stuff. If any of this is unclear, by the way, we'll cover it when we come to the seminar. But let's see if I can explain. So according to premise 1 then, we have the following. We have, oh no, there we go. We have to think of nothing. Oh dear. Is to think of nothing as being something. So you can see the idea. If you're thinking of nothing, you must be considering that thing to be something, surely. But that's wrong. The reason being, to think of nothing is not to think of... So there's a difference between thinking there is something and that something is nothing, right? So we might symbolize that, or we might put that as there is something which is nothing, and in logical form we have there is an x such that, so don't worry too much about this, but for those of you who can remember it, it's useful. There is an x such that x is nothing, and that indeed would be to think about something as being nothing, but actually if we think about nothing, really it's to think this very simply: there is not something. That's what it is to think about nothing, which is to say it's not the case that there is something. Actually, it's usually put in terms like that. It's the usual way of symbolizing. But anyway, it's clear enough. You're not thinking there is something which is nothing. What you're thinking is it's not the case that there is something. So I think I use an example in the book to try and illustrate this, about a party. Suppose somebody says to you, oh, who was at the party? And you say, oh, no one. Or, well, I'll tell you what, let's use a different example. Say, what's in the fridge? You say, oh, there's nothing in the fridge, right? Suppose then someone goes to the fridge. Oh, great, let's have a look. Hang on, I thought you said there was nothing in here, but I can't see nothing in the fridge. Where is this nothing you were talking of? Right? That would be to think of nothing as being something. Right? The misunderstanding there would be, oh, I thought you said there was something in the fridge, namely nothing. But actually, when we say there is nothing in the fridge, we don't mean that there is something in that fridge called nothing. What we mean is, it's not the case that there is something in the fridge. Right? So it's not, to think of nothing is not to think of nothing as being something. It's rather to think that there is not something. I hope that kind of makes some sense. But the point is, given that that's what it is to think of nothing, then, in fact, this argument isn't very interesting, because premise 1 is simply false, and without premise 1 in place, the rest of the argument doesn't run. It doesn't work. It might be valid, but it's not sound. So we can reject the argument, and it's not very interesting. However, there is another interpretation of what's going on in Parmenides' argument here, which I think is a better interpretation, and it's given by a chap called Ronald Hoy, and he's got a paper where he argues for this quite in depth, and I think he's got a good argument, and it does seem to be more plausible as an interpretation. So let's have a look at this second argument. So the future is supposed to be where things that do not exist issue from, and the past is supposed to be where things that cease to be go. That seems to capture something about our ordinary notion of time. Right? What's the future? Oh, well, the future, it's where things that don't yet exist are going to kind of arise from. So perhaps we'll have outposts on Mars or something. If they're in the future, then they're going to issue from the future. What's the past? Well, when things cease to be, that's where they go. It seems to capture something about our thought about the future and the past. But the future and the past are also supposed not to exist. And I think that does also capture something about our ordinary thought about the future and the past. The future is sort of yet to be. It doesn't exist, at least yet. The past doesn't exist because, well, it ceased to be. If we say, do dinosaurs exist? Well, no, they don't exist because they're in the past. They used to exist, but since they become past, they no longer exist because the past doesn't exist. So goes the thought. Well then, if we're supposed that the future is supposed to be where things that do not exist issue from, so that's what the future is supposed to be, and the past is meant to be where things cease to be go. You're almost thinking about them as being like places where things that don't yet exist come from, and things where and a place where things that cease to exist go to. But then they're in a sense supposed to both exist and not exist, and that's contradictory. And then we get the rest of these. So this is the same. What is contradictory is unthinkable. It's not possible, therefore, to think about the future and the past because, right, they've got these sort of contradictory elements within them. Then we get that premise again. What is thinkable. So if it's not possible to think about the future and the past, then the future and the past don't exist. Again, based on that, the contrapositive. If what is thinkable, then if something is not thinkable, then it cannot. Then it is not. Right. So at this point, right there, we've got a direct argument that the future and the past do not exist. That concerns time. And then on this interpretation, the idea that change doesn't occur is obtained as a corollary from this. A corollary is like an additional conclusion. Like this: if things come into and go out of existence, there is a future from which they issue from and a past into which they go. Seems right. Therefore, nothing ever comes into and goes out of existence. So there we go. I think that that's a more interesting argument. I mean, much of this, so the idea that what is contradictory is unthinkable, you might doubt that. Is it really true that you can't, that if you think about something that's contradictory, then you don't think anything at all? I mean, if you don't think anything at all, then that's like nonsense. So, if I'm thinking blah 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 or something, well, that's not to have a thought. It's just completely meaningless. But if I think about square circles, I think, square circles, as I often do, then, well, it's not the same as a blah 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 blah, right? It seems to be, so you are thinking something, you're just thinking something which perhaps, so it's not clear anyway that premise 4 is true. By the way, it's also not clear that premise 6 is true, the idea that whatever is thinkable, because couldn't there be things that exist and yet we couldn't think about them? Maybe there are some things which are so complex or something like that that our minds just can't grasp them, and if so, it's not going to be true that whatever is thinkable. But anyway, even if we do doubt these premises, I think by the time we hit number 3 here, that's already interesting. So we don't need the rest of the argument. We can reject his idea that the future and past do not exist and so on. But, even this idea that there's this tension in our thought between the idea that the future and the past are supposed to exist in some sense, but also that they're not supposed to exist. That's in itself interesting, and something which I think we'll come to later when we talk about presentism and eternalism. And I do think it's true. I do think there is this tension in our way of thinking about the future and the past. I think there is a sense in which we both think that they exist but don't exist, and and we'll come to that. But okay, good. That's all I'm going to say about Parmenides, the founder of the Eleatic school. And then in the next video, I'm going to talk about the next Eleatic of note, Zeno. So let's turn to him. Thanks all.